Hi there, Linda Behrens here. Today we're going to take a look at another one of the 16 personality types um, as we look at them as holistically as possible through different lenses. And today it's going to be the composer-producer. You may think of this most often as ISFP. So before I launch into that, uh, I'll give you just a little bit of framework about how our approach is for this. And you may have seen this in the intro video if you also looked at that. What we think we seem to know about personality types is that there are 16 patterns that have been observed for many, many years. And what goes back in many years, in centuries, is some various lenses that have looked at personality differences. And it just so happens that these line up and give us different information about each of the 16 personality types. So first, we're going to look at the holistic type pattern. And that is because wholes, W-H-O-L-E-S, wholes are what's important to think about, not the parts, but the whole. What does the whole pattern look like? So we have some descriptions that we came up with that I'm going to share with you. And then we'll take a look at essential motivators and otherwise known as temperament, that tells us why we do what we do. It will take a look at the interaction styles and how we do what we do it, which is more about our interaction patterns and our energy patterns. And we'll have a brief look at a new lens called intentional drivers, which has a lot to do with what we think about, what our intentions are. And once we have that 16 personality pattern in mind, we can unpack that in terms of the cognitive dynamics processes and the pattern of those processes. So here's the whole type pattern for composer-producer. This is a short theme that Dario Nardi and I developed as we were working on some of the books that we've written together. And it's not in bullet points, because there's something about them when they're all together that give you a different sense. So taking advantage of opportunities, stick with what's important, talent for pulling together what is just right, creative problem solving, building relationships, attracting the loyalties of others, being their own true self, have their own personal style, play against expectations, struggle with nurturing their own self-esteem. So I hope you give this some thought when you're thinking about the composer-producer ISFP pattern. This really captures the essence of that pattern in a way that the various aspects that we're going to talk about don't. So looking next at the essential motivators, the core psychological needs for someone with a composer-producer pattern is that freedom to act now, that ability to make an impact. So this is so important that they will go to great lengths to get these needs met and become stressed when they're not met. Their core values are around action, skillful performance, variety, aesthetics, and fraternal relationships. And fraternal relationships where, you know, we're equals, like brothers or sisters, I suppose. The talents, the gifts, sort of that the composer, producer, improviser pattern, especially the improviser component of that, is tactics. Now, tactics are what actions need to be taken to get a goal done, to get something done. And a talent for contextual thinking, sort of a oneness with the context, and for troubleshooting. The behaviors, tuning in with a present orientation, reciprocating, meaning we're exchanging similar kinds of behavior. The language tends to be colorful, and the primary attitude is a cynical one. And a cynical attitude means that there's sort of an expectation that somebody is up to something, a realization that very often Other people have a motive that serves what their needs are. And other behaviors, they tend to be fast reacting, to respond quickly to situations. So that's one lens. That's the essential motivator lens of improviser. And this is kind of summarizes that talent to improvise, to come up with solutions to problems that present themselves or situations where certain needs are met. If we take a look at another lens, which is the intentional drivers, the intentional drivers lens started to sort of surface in our awareness as I started to notice tandem dynamics where certain processes, cognitive processes, seem to work together. And a colleague of mine, Chris Montoya, and I refined this a little bit and came up with 4 basic patterns. Love things that come in 4s. So we have this orchestrating. Now, orchestrating is kind of like you think about a conductor is getting a whole lot of moving parts working in the same direction. So going toward this finished product, which you could really see in the composer producer in the way they pull together a variety of things that you might not even think about, and they get them all in something that is a cohesive product. The quest for this aspect is to maximize the resources and find what's workable, and knowing the priorities and then checking for credibility. So this is what orchestrating does when you are orchestrating, and when somebody who has this pattern of orchestrating in their intentional drivers will tend to do that. And it's interesting that there's a check for credibility. Is this believable? And what they want is effective outcomes, things that are actually going to work and to have action and results. That kind of sounds a little bit like improviser here with this drive to action. But they do want this action toward this end. So when we look at these 3 lenses together, we can get a picture of the composer producer thematically. And so sometimes people with this pattern have some similarities with other patterns. For example, composer producer, ISFP, often can be mistaken or misidentified as having INFP preferences, which also has behind the scenes. And it may be like the INTP variety of the pattern. So we have improviser, behind the scenes, and orchestrating. And we had that whole type theme. So now let's just unpack that in terms of the cognitive dynamics. So I use this model that John Beebe developed to show the pattern as he looked at these types over years and years and years, and from a Jungian framework. And one of the 8 functions, as Jung called them, or we call them cognitive processes, plays a leading role in the personality. In this case, this is valuing introverted feeling. And it is actually, I think this is in part why sometimes people with the composer-producer ISFP pattern may identify with and may look like they have more of a catalyst INFP pattern. So that can be a lookalike. In part, I think because of that leading role of valuing and just knowing what's important. There's something about that a colleague of mine said, it's like, I said, well, so it's like you're weighing these different things. And he said, no, I'm not weighing them. They just present themselves as one more important than the other. The supporting role for this pattern is experiencing. So that's the extroverted sensing, tuning in to what's going on, what's really happening out there. And then, being driven to act on it. And the relief role, where they like to play, is foreseeing. And they getting these insights about how things are going to be and kind of playing with that and enjoying that process. And often knowing where to go in the near term and future for accomplishing what they want to accomplish. The aspirational role for the composer producer is extroverted thinking. So that would mean that when they're engaging in that, and what they want to be is they want to be organized. And I noticed most often in the people I've been around with this pattern, that there's a fair amount of not being organized and then taking the time to get it all organized. And sometimes in a business sense, really knowing, okay, here's what we need to do next and what we need to do next and we need to do next. So putting that kind of structure coming a little more easily than you might think, just looking at the 4 letters in the type code, for example. Then if we look at what are the shadow processes? Those are the primary processes. What are the shadow processes? Well, in this case, there's an opposing role, or it's also supportive, which is extroverted feelings. So here is this pattern, composer-producer, with an improviser, highly autonomous drive to be, call the shots on their own actions, also having access to the connecting of extroverted feeling and making connections and doing things for others because that's what they want. Very, very interesting. Kind of almost a little bit like, oh, wait a minute, that's opposite. That's not the same. The critical parent role is reviewing. So going over can easily get stuck in the past. Going over the past, what went wrong, kind of expecting things to be down on themselves for the mistakes they've made. And so in some ways suffering from some esteem issues sometimes because of that. And then the deceiving role is interpreting. And this kind of plays into that reviewing, because interpreting, when it's in this deceiving role on the negative side especially, can really tune into some possible meanings of something that maybe aren't quite on target. So misreading people's intentions, even though the composer-producer ISFP pattern really does have a keen sense of what's going on with others most of the time. But when they're, in the downside, it can be this misinterpreting sometimes. And then the devilish role, analyzing, and they can get caught up in that constant, kind of looking at analyzing a situation in a sort of an objective way, so that objective but skewed more often in the negative side, and get kind of wrapped around a flagpole, if you will, with that. So kind of a devilish way where they have decided that something isn't following a principle that they've been holding on to. So that's a look at the composer-producer ISFP pattern, and I hope this helps you understand this pattern a little bit more. And if you think you relate to that, then maybe it adds some clarity to your own self-understanding.